Alright, so today we're going to talk about tag team wrestling for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, tag team wrestling started life as an arcade game developed by Technos and published by Data East. It was later ported to the various computer platforms across Japan and the US, but the most familiar version of the game that most of us would have seen was on the NES. The game was similar in all releases, with the main differences being the names of the fighters and what they called the moves, a few little graphic differences, but the gameplay itself was virtually identical. It also has a few distinctions, one of which is that it was Data East's first release for the NES. They would go on to follow that up with some pretty decent titles, including Bad Dudes, Burger Time, Kid Nicky. They even got some licensed titles like Captain America and the Avengers. Another distinction is that this was actually the very first game I rented for the NES, several times. It wasn't my favorite game, but it was the only wrestling game available to us at the time, so in spite of how much I disliked the game, I kept coming back to it. A lot of the problems I had, I think, stemmed from not really knowing how to play, and the copy I rented didn't have the instruction manual. Now, with most games, that wasn't really an issue. It was Nintendo. You had a D-pad, you had a couple of buttons. It was pretty straightforward, but every once in a while, you'd run across something like this, or maybe hide-lide, things like that. You just kind of had to stumble across the main mechanics of the game and hope you picked up enough to at least finish or beat your friends. The game's premise is pretty simple. You play as a tag team called the Ricky Fighters, and you play against the strong bads of internet fame, and that's it. There's no other characters. If you're playing solo, you can't even use the strong bads. The Ricky Fighters are the babyface team, and that's what the game expects you to use. Only by playing the two-player game mode can someone get to control the strong bads, which, given how little there is to do in this game, seems like an odd decision. Even being able to select the other team might have given this game a little bit of replay value, but instead it's just one team and done. The controls are pretty simple, but a little bit difficult. You can move around the ring. You have an attack and an action button. Attacking will make your character throw a punch. If the punch connects, you are given 3 seconds to choose an action from a list of 7 moves that pops up. Once you scroll to the desired action with the action button and then press attack, the move is performed and the other player gets knocked down. There's no ground type moves of any kind. From that position, you either pin them or you let them up and the sequence starts again. Both players have a health meter, and when that gets low, you can pin the opponent for a 3 count or use a submission type move to force them to quit. The difficulty here lays in having to scroll through this list. You don't really have time to read any of it, and sometimes you're just choosing random moves. If you take your time, usually the time limit will expire and the other player takes over on advantage. So usually you would just tap the button a few times, hit attack, hope for the best. If you button mash the attack button trying to get that punch in, the way the game almost encourages you to do, you pretty much always just end up doing the first move that pops up, and that gets stale quickly. Also, if you're facing a specific fighter, you get an 8th move on your list, which is your special move. For your team, it's a sharpshooter type leg lock, or a scorpion deathlock, or a brainbuster for your other character. These moves do a ton of damage, and they can often end a match, but scrolling down to the 8th position without going past it, and then hitting attack within that small time window can be really tricky to pull off. This sometimes could make doing the special moves feel like an accomplishment, but usually it's just frustrating. Most of the matches I ended up playing did not end with one of those moves. Now, if you do some moves near the ropes, the move will end with either the opponent or both of you falling out of the ring and taking significant damage. Occasionally, a ring bell is just laying there and can be used on your opponent. There's a few grapple moves you have, again with the list outside the ring, and that's about the limit of what you can do out there. The AI isn't overly smart, but it doesn't really have to be. It just comes at you, and you try to hit your attack at the right time to take advantage. It can feel ridiculously hard at times, and button mashing does not help, even though it feels like a button mash sort of game. Your best bet is to try to learn when to time the attack, and with a bit of luck, you'll get in more attacks than your opponent does. It's easier to time the attack if you're standing over them as they get up, and it's even easier to do moves outside, so feel free to completely abuse that if you need to. Try not to totally drain their health though, otherwise they just run up to make the tag when you get back into the ring and you're helpless to stop them when they do that. Now, to add to the difficulty, the AI team will occasionally go into a fury that is difficult, if not impossible, to defend yourself against. This can happen as frequently as 10 seconds apart. Sometimes you'll see them change even if they're laying on the mat. If that occurs, just pinning them will change them back to their normal status. You aren't completely without your own answer to this, but it is very limited. On matches 5, 11, 18, and 28, by doing a certain number of tags without touching your opponent at the beginning, you power up. Your character flickers, and the CPU won't be able to stop your attacks. This only lasts until the opponent tags in, however, and a single boost in the occasional match really isn't something that compares with being on the receiving end of an invincible bull rushing every few moves. Now, while you never face any other opponents, there is some sense of progression here. You start in a division, you win so many matches, you get a trophy. You move to a higher division, you win that, you get a bigger trophy. There is some sense of drive to reach higher rounds just to see how big that trophy's going to get. I won't spoil it here, because if you ever decide to play the game, that mystery might just be the only thing that keeps you playing. Also, while not listed in the instructions, which I was able to find years later, you can continue the game after a loss by holding up on the D-pad and pressing start. Graphics, they're about what you'd expect on an early 8-bit wrestler. It looked better on this console than any other, including the arcade version, but that's not saying much. The animations are pretty basic, and during some of the moves it's just weird, like the way the characters will lift their arms while they're running, or how a flying headbutt literally does cause you to fly the entire length of the ring before connecting with the move. But you'll never have much trouble understanding who's who or what's going on in the match, so that's about as much as we could hope for. For the most part, sound is in the same boat. There's nothing overly good about it, but not much stands out as being terrible either. The grunts that the wrestlers make when they take a move can be a little off-putting, but otherwise, compare that to the arcade version where everything's just ear-splittingly awful. You'll be glad this is the version that you're playing. This game was another example of how we just played what we had back then, and we made the most of it. I remember being frustrated by this game, but it wasn't enough to make me stop playing it, at least until some other wrestling games eventually released, which were way better and got me away from things like this. When you've got nothing else to compare it to, games like this had their bright spots, but it's hard to make a case for it now. The mechanic of a menu of actions controlling your moves is interesting, and I can't think of any other wrestling game that's ever tried something that unique. I wonder sometimes if some fringe indie game that revamped this style might be at all popular. Combine the action of pro wrestling with the tactics and control of a JRPG. It sounds silly and it would probably flop, but it's the people who try those crazy ideas that come up with some of the better games that end up becoming cult favorites over time. I know I would play something like that if somebody tried making it. So this is Tag Team Wrestling. One of the first, if not one of the best. I'd be hard-pressed to recommend this to anyone to actually play, but it is amazing the stuff that some people can get into, and if you're into this weird kind of thing, give it a whirl if you've got nothing better to do. At least you'll be able to say you played the very first wrestling game on the NES. So, thanks for joining us for another episode of Retro Wrestling Reviews. If you're enjoying these, please drop a like, sub, whatever you do. Pretend I'm one of your favorites and do whatever you do for them. Unless, you would stalk them and try and wear their skin or collect hair or something. Please don't ever do that to me. For now, this is the Real 2K Gamer signing off. Until next time, see you guys.